thanks to a spike in coronavirus cases in the Upper Peninsula. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has decided to pump the brakes and halt the state's progression into Phase 5 of her reopening plan. Michigan also has approximately 1.5 million school children who are waiting to see if they'll be back in the classroom or in front of a computer to learn this fall. I tackle these issues and so much more with Lauren Gibbons, an MLive reporter and a member of their public interest team covering politics. She joined me this week to provide her political viewpoints on everything politics in Michigan. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. We want to welcome you to Let's Have This Conversation, and we're excited to talk a little Michigan politics with you this afternoon.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, Lauren, when we look at the governor's decision to halt the state's progression into Phase 5, certainly it started with a spike in cases up in the Upper Peninsula, but then we saw that there were some nightclubs in Detroit last weekend that weren't exactly social distancing. So I'm just wanting to start you off with your opinion on the governor's decision not to enter Phase 5 of reopening.
Yeah, I think that as you mentioned, we have seen a little bit of an uptick in terms of new cases, and part of that is due to a rise in cases here in Lansing, where I'm based. There's one particular bar where more than 50 cases have now come out of interactions at that particular bar. So you are seeing in a few areas. It doesn't seem as though it's the entire state at this point, but there are a few areas where it's pretty clear that some of the reopening process has resulted in a few new cases here and there. So I think the state is monitoring those situations and seeing, when it might be prudent to continue on with that reopening process.
Can you tell me, I know that the Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist is heading up a commission to look into the spike in coronavirus cases and how it disproportionately affects African Americans. Certainly, it's killing more African Americans, the virus, than any other particular group. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That was, I believe, the task force was started in April to begin looking into those disparities. As you mentioned, in Michigan, particularly in southeastern Michigan, those trends were very clear, and that's kind of been replicated around the country based on what data is showing. So the task force is meeting and continues to look at why that might be, some of the factors into it. As far as I'm aware, they have not released their results or what they've come up with yet, but Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist and other members of the task force have said it's crucial, especially now that the country is having such a reckoning about race, that these issues be looked into more.
And I'm just wondering, do you think with the spike in cases, because I know the governor wanted to enter Phase 5 by July 4th. So I'm just wondering, do you think that's going to happen now?
I'm not 100% sure at this point. It does seem as though it's a little bit of a different equation than when she said, things could reopen by the 4th of July. It's not with a couple of instances of some increases in cases. So it's possible that she changes that date. However, it does seem as though a lot of businesses are rearing to go, especially when it comes to gyms. I know that there's ongoing legal battle in terms of whether or not they can open. So there are a lot of businesses out there who are saying, we want to try to have the chance to reopen here. So I think if she does decide not to reopen some of those businesses by July 4th, she'll see some pushback.
And then she also recently signed an executive order allowing sports to resume without fans. We know that the Tigers are coming back at the beginning of July to start training camp, and then by the middle of July they'll be there to start the season by July 23rd or 24th. So I'm
Mhm.
just wondering if you could expand on how you think the world or the state will look with sports back without fans.
It's so unprecedented, right? And no one really knows exactly how it will look. But I think a lot of fans out there, while they may be disappointed that they won't be able to, go to a Tigers game and have the same experience, I'm sure that a lot of folks out there are going to be pretty excited to be able to watch sports again. I think a lot of people were, pretty sad to see March Madness and several month delay on baseball. So I think that there's going to be a lot of happy fans out there, even if they're not able to, go into the stands and root for their favorite teams.
Yeah, just one follow up on Jim. Certainly, the industry is going to have some major changes once they're allowed to reopen in terms of the social distancing and moving machines and the like. So, how do you think the industry is going to come back once uh, they're allowed to reopen? Because certainly, with the restrictions in place, it may be more expensive to stay open as opposed to staying closed.
Yeah, I think gyms are really interesting because it's one of those areas that experts are very concerned about in terms of possible coronavirus exposure risk. People are breathing heavily. They're using the same machines as other patrons at the gym. So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny as to how gyms keep things clean and really get into like making sure that these capacity limits, presuming that gyms will be subject to the same capacity limits that bars, restaurants, and other businesses that are allowed to be open. And so it will be interesting to see. And as you mentioned, I think there is a factor in terms of whether these increased costs uh, negates the fact that they're allowed to reopen and be allowed to continue, issuing memberships and making money again. So I think there's a lot of unknowns right now. But from what I'm hearing from gyms, there's a lot of gyms are ready to reopen and start trying to meet those proceedings. Although a lot of experts are very concerned that there could be a higher exposure risk there.
Can I now ask you about schools as well, as we know that Michigan has about 1.5 million public school kids, and I know the governor appointed a task force to also look at the safe reopening of schools. So do you think we'll be ready to put kids back into the classroom by September, or do you think virtual learning will continue?
As far as I have heard now, I think a lot of people are thinking that could vary around the state, right? That there could be areas where there are less coronavirus cases. It may be more prudent to, have especially younger children go back into the classroom. And there are other areas where we don't know what it will look like in the fall, but it could be difficult to determine and potentially, get kids back in. So I think at this point, a lot of the question will be, how much should schools prepare for that virtual learning? making sure that kids who may not have access to broadband at home, have the access to learning that they need, and really just make sure that there's not a learning gap. There's a lot of questions that need to continue to be answered. But I think Governor Whitmer said that she's optimistic that there will be in-person learning in the fall, and the legislative Republicans also recently released a plan saying that they would at least like to see the younger students, the K through, I believe, fourth grade, also see in-person learning. So it could go a lot of different ways here.
And as you know, Jolly Nooner is this weekend, and I know the governor is concerned about the possible spike in cases. So do you think people should be worried about going out in the water this weekend, and the people who do that when they come back? Is the governor concerned at all about what may transpire this weekend?
I think the governor has expressed concerns about a lot of large gatherings, especially when it comes to mask wearing and social distancing. I think that that's really been the point that the administration has tried to hit the hardest. Keep to your own social group, social distance with other members of the public, and wear masks. In terms of on the water, I'm not sure how much mask wearing there might be. I haven't seen any photos come out of it yet, but so I think that there may be some cause for concern about transmission there. It does just depend a lot on whether I guess it just depends a lot on how close people are in contact, and whether or not they're transmitting the virus.
Now, back in 2016, the president won Michigan by a slim margin, as you know, but he seems to be down quite substantially in Michigan, and we know that Michigan is a swing state. No president usually can win the White House without winning Michigan. So I'm just wondering the role you see Michigan playing in the upcoming general election in November.
Yeah, as you said, Michigan is a huge, crucial state for both parties at this point. Democrats would like to see it go back to them in 2020, whereas for President Trump, this was a huge victory for his campaign in terms of convincing Michigan voters, or at least a slim majority of Michigan voters, to go his way. So there's still several months yet. There's a lot of things that can change before November, but Michigan is going to continue being a huge factor. And I'm not 100% sure what rallies will look like going forward, but I would expect to see, presidential campaign stops and potentially surrogates for the campaign spending a lot of time in Michigan ahead of the election.
Can I just ask you about the increase in national exposure for the governor? Certainly, she's been one of the bigger factors supporting Joe Biden, and sort of one of the bigger figureheads when it comes to handling the virus. So could I just ask you about the increased national profile of the governor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she just had a New York Times profile published the other day. Multiple national organizations have either had her on television programs, and several newspapers and magazines have also sought the governor for profiles and other stories. So yeah, she's definitely gotten a lot of exposure at the national level. I think you're seeing her as kind of obviously the coronavirus, and her response to the virus is a big part of that, but she also has become a vocal Democratic voice, challenging Trump on a lot of his decisions. So especially for the Biden campaign, to have someone like that in a key Midwestern state, as we talked about, is something that I think they're trying to play up. She's still technically in the vice presidential conversation, although I think that she's kind of gone down a couple of slots in terms of who might get picked at the end of the day. But It's certainly notable that she continues to kind of have this national coverage as she navigates the coronavirus and several other issues that have come up during her tenure.
And can I ask you just your personal opinion on how you think the national election is going now, or the general election is proceeding now, as opposed to how it may look in November?
Um, I guess it's a little hard to say because so many things that I may have predicted about how 2020 go like throughout the window because of the coronavirus. So there's going to be a big impact depending on whether the coronavirus has a second wave or gets worse in the fall, as some experts have predicted. That will definitely have an impact on how voting is conducted in Michigan. The Secretary of State is pushing a vote by mail. She's sending absentee ballot applications to voters, and so that conversation will potentially have an impact just how people are voting, and how people interact with campaigns is going to be a pretty big issue as well, just because typically you see these rallies, politicians come and shake hands and kiss babies or all those kind of things, and all of those things are just not a factor.
Gonna happen this year, yeah.
You got to stay 6 feet away from them. So it's just going to be a really interesting test case in how elections are run with less physical contact with people.
For sure. Now, my final question for you is, outside of the coronavirus, what do you think has been the biggest Michigan political headline with nearly half the year now over?
You sent me this question. I was struggling to think about that because the coronavirus has really just taken over the conversation. And I think one possible area where it's still technically related to the coronavirus, I think we're going to see a huge conversation coming up in the next few months about how Michigan affords to balance its budget. And that could have impacts on local governments. It could have impacts on schools. It could have impacts on roads and so many other facets of Michigan life. We're facing a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit right now because of a decrease in sales tax and income tax. And so I think that's going to be a huge factor. I also think it's important to note the whole country is currently talking about police brutality and how to move forward with with local police departments, and how the criminal justice system as a whole should change and factor in a lot of concerns that are being brought up by the George Floyd protests. And we're starting to see some conversations in the Michigan legislature about how they plan to handle that. You're seeing conversations at the local level as well. So I think that is also a huge story that is going to continue to gain importance as the protests continue, and as folks continue to push their elected officials for something more.
Hey, Lauren, we want to take a few minutes to thank you for your appearance on the show. We had a lot of fun talking Michigan politics with you this afternoon, and we want to thank you for your insights and perspectives. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to do it, and feel free to have me back on if you need me.
Fantastic. I'll hold you to that. How about that?
Okay, well, sounds great. Thank you so much. Thanks for reaching out, and yeah, like I said, happy to be here.